"Dad, that girl has Mom's locket." The words cut through the idle noise of the car. The soft jazz Wesley kept low on mornings like this, the distant groan of a delivery truck pulling away from the curb, the familiar percussion of downtown Chicago beginning its Thursday. Adrian was 12 years old enough to know the difference between a real memory and a dream, and his voice had the weight of someone who was certain. Wesley's eyes moved to the sidewalk. She stood near the entrance of St. Camilla's Soup Kitchen on West Jackson, half tucked behind a dumpster, a slight girl with matted dark hair and a canvas backpack, 2 sizes too large for her shoulders. Her coat was a man's denim jacket, frayed at both cuffs, far too thin for November in Chicago. She was watching the line of people filing into the shelter, not joining it, just watching, with the careful sideways attention of a child who had learned to read a room before entering it. Around her neck, catching the weak winter light, was a small gold oval locket on a chain. Wesley's phone was still in his hand. He didn't remember dropping it into his lap. "She's running," Adrian said. He was right. The girl had seen them looking. In the half-second it took Wesley to reach for the door handle, she had already moved, ducked around the dumpster, through a gap in the fence line, gone. Wesley was out of the car before he could explain himself to himself. He crossed the sidewalk in long strides, reached the fence, looked through. A narrow service alley. Empty, the sound of the city filling every direction. She was gone. He stood there in the cold while his driver idled at the curb, and Adrian watched him through the window with his mother's careful brown eyes. Wesley's hands had gone cold, and not from the weather. That locket had been his grandmother's. He had given it to Elaine on their 5th anniversary, sitting at the kitchen table at the old house in Lincoln Park, rain on the windows, candles they'd lit because the power had flickered out. She had held it in both hands for a long time before she put it on. She was wearing it the last night he saw her. That was 10 years ago. The official account said Elaine had experienced a severe postpartum breakdown following a difficult pregnancy. She had been admitted voluntarily to Cedarwood Recovery Center in November. She had died of cardiac failure the following February. Wesley had been handed a death certificate, a sealed urn, and the sincere condolences of his older brother Aldous, who had handled all the arrangements because Wesley, he was told, was in no condition to. Wesley had believed it. He had been 29 days out of the hospital himself, recovering from a car accident that had kept him from Elaine's bedside during the worst of it. He had believed it because he had been broken open by grief, and Aldous was the person who always handled things, the way older brothers in certain families are appointed to handle things, quietly, with authority no one votes on. He had believed it until now. He pulled out his phone on the ride to his office and found the photograph he had not looked at in years. Elaine, laughing at a July 4th barbecue, her head tilted back. The locket lay against the base of her throat, oval, gold, with a small daisy etched into its face. He stared at the photograph for the rest of the drive. Cormac Walsh had a desk covered in accordion folders and a parking ticket he'd been using as a bookmark for 6 months. He was 61 years old, had spent 22 of those years as a Chicago PD detective, and now occupied a 3rd-floor walk-up on North Dearborn, doing the kind of work that didn't always make it into police reports. Wesley had used him twice before for corporate due diligence. He was the only person Wesley could think of who would not immediately try to talk him out of what he was asking. Cormac listened without interrupting. When Wesley finished, he tapped the photograph on the desk between them and said only, "The locket. Describe it again." Wesley described it again. Cormac made a note. The results came in stages over the next 2 weeks, each one quieter and more damaging than the last. The death certificate for Elaine Grace Pemberton had been filed by a Dr. R. Harrow, except there was no practicing physician in Illinois by that name. Cedarwood Recovery Center, where Elaine had supposedly been admitted, had closed for structural renovation the previous September and hadn't reopened until the following spring. The funeral home that had processed the cremation was under investigation by the Illinois Attorney General for record fraud in 3 unrelated cases. The payments for Elaine's care, $6,000 a month drawn from a Pemberton family shell account, had continued for 10 years. The last transaction had cleared the previous Tuesday. 10 years. She was being paid for. She was somewhere. Cormac set a property record on Wesley's desk. Meadow Ridge Wellness Center, he said. Walworth County, Wisconsin. Rural. Private. Owned by a company called Lakeshore Medical Holdings. He paused. Lakeshore Medical Holdings is a subsidiary of Aldous Pemberton's personal investment firm. Wesley sat very still. There's more, Cormac said, and he sounded like a man who wished there were not. A girl was born at Meadow Ridge, approximately 9.5 years ago. Birth certificate filed under Jane Doe, infant female, transferred immediately to Illinois foster care. Last known placement, a family in Pilsen. She ran away 3 years ago. He slid another document across the desk. Age at disappearance, 6 years old. Wesley put his hands flat on the desk to keep them steady. His daughter had been out there alone since she was 6 years old. Blythe Odom had been a child welfare caseworker with the city for 11 years. She had the voice of someone who had learned to make it carry warmth even when the news was not warm. She called Wesley's office after a small item appeared in the Tribune. 4 paragraphs about a Chicago executive searching for a child, witnessed near St. Camilla's Soup Kitchen. The piece had run at the suggestion of Quinn Reeves, the Tribune's pharmaceutical industry reporter, buried on page B6, specific enough to reach the right people and vague enough not to spook them. I know the child you're looking for, Blythe said. She won't come to an office and she won't go near a shelter, but she trusts me. Give me 2 days. The girl was sheltering under the Green Line tracks at Paulina, in a corner behind a utility panel she'd fitted with cardboard and a sleeping bag. Blythe had found it 7 weeks earlier, but hadn't reported the location, knowing that doing so would cause the girl to disappear again. Instead, she'd been leaving food in a paper bag near the panel twice a week. She brought Wesley on the 3rd visit. The girl called herself Gracie. She was small and deliberate in her movements, with dark eyes that assessed a situation the way older people's eyes do, taking in exits and intentions simultaneously. She wore the locket over a thrift store turtleneck, tucked slightly inside the collar. When she saw Wesley, she stepped back, not running but ready to. Blythe said quietly, "He's not here to take you anywhere, sweetheart. He just wants to talk." What brought Gracie out of her wariness was not Wesley at all. It was Adrian, who had come despite Wesley's hesitation, who crouched down at the entrance to the space and looked at the tin can Gracie kept on a small plank shelf, a coffee can packed with pressed flowers. Daisies, mostly, some dried past recognition. "My mom liked daisies," Adrian said, not to provoke, just to say. Gracie looked at him for a long time. Then she pulled the locket from inside her collar and held it out toward the light, not handing it over, just showing. The daisy etched on the face. She opened it with a fingernail, careful and practiced. She had opened it 10,000 times, maybe more, and inside was a photograph, faded nearly to pale, a newborn in a hospital blanket, eyes closed, impossibly small. The photo had come with the locket in a paper envelope marked with infant. She had looked at it so many times she no longer saw the baby clearly. She just knew it meant something. Adrian leaned forward. He recognized the hospital room behind the bassinet, the pale green wall. His father had the twin of this photograph in a frame on his office desk. He looked up at Wesley. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She used to hum," Gracie said finally. She wasn't explaining herself. She was testing something. "The woman who came to my room sometimes, I wasn't supposed to go, but the night nurse let me." She touched the locket's edge with one finger. "I don't know the song, I just know what it feels like." Adrian sat down cross-legged on the cold concrete in his school clothes. "Can you hum it?" he asked. Gracie hummed 4 or 5 notes, uncertain, a question more than a melody. Adrian's breath caught. He knew those notes. He had always known them. He'd thought for years it was something he'd invented, some internal music he'd made up in early childhood to comfort himself. He had never been able to explain it to anyone, had never found it in any real song. He hummed the next 4 notes, completing the phrase. Gracie stared at him. "Yeah," she said, quiet, like a door opening somewhere she hadn't known there was a wall. Quinn Reeves had been covering the pharmaceutical industry for the Tribune for 8 years. She had started her investigation of Pemberton Pharmaceuticals 2 years earlier, following a tip from a former clinical trial coordinator who claimed the company had suppressed adverse event data for its flagship painkiller. Hundreds of patients, concealed cardiac risks, data quietly altered before FDA submission. She had been trying to find the source of the original internal complaint, the person who had first documented the fraud before it was buried, when Wesley Pemberton called her. The name in the suppressed email chain was Elaine Pemberton, Wesley's wife, written 10 years ago, 3 months before she disappeared. She had known. She had gathered the data herself. She had been preparing to go to the FDA when she vanished. "Your brother didn't just take your wife," Quinn told Wesley, sitting in his living room with a laptop and 2 filing boxes. "He protected a billion-dollar product. The institutionalization was the cover. Your wife was the threat." Wesley didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "How quickly can you publish?" "Tonight if I need to, but if we can get Elaine on record first." She let the sentence finish itself. "We get her out first," Wesley said. "The story runs after she's safe." Quinn nodded. "Then we move. Aldous will know you've been asking about Cedarwood, if he hasn't already." Cormac's phone rang. He answered, listened, hung up. "Transfer order at Meadow Ridge," he said. "Signed this morning. They're moving her tomorrow night." Meadow Ridge Wellness Center sat back from the county road behind a stand of white pine trees, long and low and pale against the November sky. There was a wrought iron fence and a camera over the front entrance and a security desk that Quinn walked through first, alone, with press credentials and a scheduled interview with the facility director about rural mental health access. She wore a lapel camera, feeding to a live stream she had not yet activated. Cormac and Wesley came in through the back service entrance. Cormac had scouted 2 days prior. Blythe stayed in the van with the children. Gracie sat in the back seat looking at the pine trees and said nothing. She had been quiet the entire drive up from Chicago. Adrian sat next to her, not talking either, close enough that their jacket sleeves were touching. Elaine was in room 14 on the 2nd floor. Wesley moved through the facility's painted concrete corridors with the deliberate calm of someone who understands that falling apart is not an option available to them right now. He would save that for later, in private, in whatever form it took. Right now, there was only the number on the wall and the sound of his own footsteps. He opened the door. She was sitting at the window. The decade had put silver in her dark hair, shadows under her eyes. She was thinner than any photograph he still had of her. But her hands, folded in her lap, were the same hands. The way she turned toward the door was the same. She looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone verifying that what they see is real and not another fragment of whatever the medication had been constructing in the place of actual perception. Then she said, "You took too long." Her voice was rough from disuse, but it was entirely hers. "I know," he said. Aldous Pemberton arrived 22 minutes later in a black SUV with 2 men from his private security firm. He had been called by the facility director the moment Wesley walked in. He strode through the front entrance with the authority of a man who has spent 58 years getting what he wanted through force of certainty, and found himself facing Quinn Reeves in the lobby, standing with a camera crew and a live stream running to 112,000 viewers and climbing. "Mr. Pemberton," Quinn said pleasantly, "do you have a statement about Meadow Ridge Wellness Center and your family's connection to its ownership? We've been live for about 8 minutes. The comments have a great deal of interest in the transfer order signed this morning." The state police arrived 11 minutes after that, having received Cormac's full evidence package by secure email at 9:50 that morning, with a follow-up call from Quinn's legal team at 10:15. Aldous was still trying to explain himself, using words like intervention and family concern and mental health crisis, when Wesley came through the lobby with Elaine at his side. She moved carefully, one hand on his arm, but her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. She had told Wesley in the room upstairs that she'd been aware for the last 8 months. They had reduced her medication during a transition period, and her mind had sharpened back with a speed that had frightened even her. She had been counting days by meal deliveries. She had heard news of an investigation into Pemberton Pharmaceuticals weeks ago. She had started to hope. Now she stood in the lobby of the place that had held her for 10 years and looked at her brother-in-law with an expression that was not only anger. "The data is still there," she said, to him and to the camera both. "I kept copies. I hid them before you could get to them. You should have known I would." Aldous said nothing. Outside, Blythe had brought the children up from the van. Gracie stood in the cold parking lot with her hands in the pockets of her too large coat, looking at the building. She had been here. She didn't remember it, but she had been here. She had started here, in this building, in this county, in a room somewhere above that lobby, and she had been taken from here and had spent years not knowing the name of what she had lost. The front doors opened. Wesley came through first, and then a woman with silver-threaded dark hair and careful eyes, stepping into the November air for the first time in 10 years. Elaine saw Adrian first. She stopped walking. He had been 2 years old. He had her eyes, and he was 12 now, and she had missed everything in between, and none of that could be undone. Adrian crossed the parking lot at a pace that started as walking and became something else before he reached her. Elaine held on to him for a long time. When she finally looked past him, she saw Gracie. Gracie had not moved. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, holding the locket in one hand. She'd taken it off, was holding it by the chain, like she wasn't sure anymore whether she was allowed to keep it. Elaine walked toward her slowly. Gracie did not step back. When she reached her, Elaine did not try to embrace her. She understood, without being told, that you do not ask that of a child who has been unknown to you for 10 years. Instead, she cupped both hands around Gracie's, the one holding the locket, and held them gently, the way you hold something fragile that you are not willing to let fall. "I put that in your blanket," Elaine said. "I had maybe 40 seconds. You were crying, and they were already moving you, and I needed you to have something of mine." Gracie looked down at their hands. "I kept flowers," she said. "Daisies mostly. I've kept every one I ever found. I never knew why. I just always did." Elaine's breath came out unsteady. "I know why," she said. Behind them, the live stream was still running. Somewhere in the comments, a woman in Ohio was typing that she was crying at her kitchen table and didn't even know these people. 170,000 people were watching a moment that had no narrator, because none was needed. 3 months later, the kitchen in the Lincoln Park house smelled like coffee and slightly burned toast, which was Gracie's contribution to Saturday mornings. She had taken a strong interest in the toaster despite consistent evidence that she and the toaster had not yet reached an understanding. 4 minutes again, Adrian said, without looking up from his sketchbook. "I was busy," Gracie said. "You were looking out the window." "That's still busy." Wesley refilled his coffee and did not intervene. He had learned in 3 months that his children did not need intervention so much as witnesses. They were building something between them, a language of two, pieced together from shared silences and a shared melody and a habit they had both independently developed of pressing flowers flat and keeping them in unlikely containers. It was still new. It would always be somewhat new, he thought, and that was fine. Elaine came downstairs in her old cardigan, the one she'd found in a box in the attic where Wesley had kept everything, because getting rid of it had never once felt like the right thing to do. She poured coffee and stood at the window looking at the backyard, where last week's snow had turned gray at the edges and small green shoots were pushing through near the fence. The Foundation for Medical Transparency that Elaine was building had its opening press conference scheduled for April. Quinn was on the board. The Pemberton Pharmaceuticals case was in federal court. Aldous had declined every offer to cooperate. He would spend the next portion of his life in a courtroom, and that was a different kind of justice than Wesley had imagined for years, but it was the real kind, the durable kind. He watched his family over the rim of his coffee cup. Gracie rescued the toast, slightly charred at the corners, and set it on the table with a butter knife and the expression of someone presenting something that was fine, actually. Adrian made a diplomatic face and took a piece. Elaine came to sit down, and for a moment the four of them were just there, in the ordinary imperfection of a Saturday morning. The kind that passes without record and is somehow the whole point. "There's a daisy," Gracie said, pointing at the window. They looked. Between two gray patches of snow, one small yellow flower had forced its way through the cold ground near the base of the fence, early, improbable, entirely unconcerned with whether anyone thought it should be there yet. Elaine reached across the table and put her hand over Gracie's. Outside, the morning light fell across the yard in long, pale strips, the winter sun doing what it always does, arriving anyway, quiet and unhurried, long after everything that tried to stop it had worn itself out.